part of it. Same people who so inextricably intertwine a woman's life with a foolish are incredibly obtuse in the way they cannot or will not see that women have to eat too. They do love food. This deplorable truth was highlighted by Dr. Tripura Sundari Srinivasan in her acceptance speech with the Sahitya Award way back in 1984. Now she's a medical practitioner who wrote to the Dead Pattern and with a flourishing practice in South Africa. Speaking from a wealth of clinical experience, she said Dr. Srinivasan alerted people about the way it led to serious health hazards such as anemia, protein deficiency, and other pregnancy-related problems in women and children. She had more disturbing data. In some families, men devour even the food that is kept aside for their own children. This was Dr. Srinivasan's data, where she appealed to everyone to fight against this appalling practice that masquerades as a normal situation. To begin with the micro unit of family, I will read a short excerpt from the story Annapurna Bhavan from my latest collection of short fiction and English titles. Guilt, Trip, and Other Stories. That will be published by Niyugi in August. I am very grateful to my publisher, Ms. Trisha Devi, the director, Shri Nirmal Gandhi.
Just move the mic towards yourself, please. Yeah.
The director, Shri Nirmal Gandhi, and my editor, Ms. Anvisha Panda, for their culture-sensitive editing and production. The book is creatively designed to assimilate certain ethnic and symbolic graphics that shows Tamil Nadu in a visual pattern. In her foreword to this book, Professor Sanjita Dasgupta, the convener of the Akademi's language at Board, shares her insightful observations from the short story. As a Jew, in the 21st century, along with the resurgence of interest, she says, in narrative poems, readers' interest in short fiction is on a growing curve. And she says this is because of region-specific signifiers that are accommodated in a short story. And in a foreword, she cites very interesting examples from Bengali women writers who plumb the depths of the short story to a great extent and use the reflection. So this Annapurna Bhavan, to give you a short introduction. The protagonist of the story is Tara, and she has been asked to have a lunch and meet the rest of the family somewhere, and her family is advising her to have lunch in all of the fancy places in Chennai, Taj Kunimara, Dreamtree Hotel, Akademi, Rebel, and all those fancy places. And her driver Bhavan wants to have his lunch in a small, modest little place called Annapurna Bhavan in a narrow lane in Chennai. She decides to have lunch with him. And he's horrified. He said, "What will Tsar do?" He said, "Simple, don't tell him. Just don't tell him. I'm just going to have lunch with you in this Annapurna." And she goes and she tells her, "Okay, Amma, you see, in this Annapurna Bhavan, they serve on a banana leaf, course by course by course. They will put it out on a thali or kaduri, and then it is like Devi Annapurneshwari who is coming to serve like a mother. That is why it is called Annapurna Bhavan," she says. Okay, then both of them go, and he is very, very uncomfortable that they are there. So Tara, she looked around fascinated. Already some of the women seemed to be halfway through their meal. The hall swarmed with women in brightly colored sarees, their glass and gold bangles twinkling on their wrists, their faces eager to catch up on news while they went on a sustained banter. Very friendly banter over their lunch. It looked like many of them the friends who had fixed up a date and time to meet here for a girls' day out in this humble place. One piece of introduction that I want to see about this class is I am depicting the lower middle class traveling women who are always in the grind, who never get to learn discourses on feminist discourse in English, who never go to seminars with high profile participants who do not function much in English. How do they get together for their study time? She was amazed. I was amazed to see the way they keep a lively thread of conversation going, but at the same time they were mindful of what reached their leaf and what got missed. Why do I use this word leaf? Is a speech pattern in fact. Whenever there is a meal with a banana leaf, and then you will find a man or woman saying, this leaf did not get courier, that leaf did not get something. It will become very impersonal. This leaf, and it helps the people who serve. So they were all saying about this leaf and that leaf, and they were looking after the leaves of their friends. And they were teasing, they were being served by a very warm set of male waiters. And one, they call the waiters Anne, elder. One woman says, Anne, you've forgotten this leaf? Yes, sister, I'm coming to you. What leaf? Mokkuillu or slumber? Both. I didn't do, you see, and when she said both, there were peals of laughter all around her. One woman teased her, was stopping her. Hey, Shankaran, if you eat like this, you're going to put on weight. Oh, shut up. I have come to my mother's house. I can eat as much as I want without your husband's younger sister or his widowed aunt or your mother-in-law looking at you disapprovingly. Exactly. They think we women should not eat heartily. It's considered unseemly. Well then, let them come and take a look at us. We'll show them how decorous we are, she said, while we are eating, slurping the song. Other women from the table joined her, and there were squeals of laughter all around the group. When she left the place, Tara felt as if a great weight had slid off from her shoulders. The bird fluttered its wings and flew out of her chest. As she walked out of the place, the chattering women in brightly colored saris, bangles tinkling on their wrists, with their carefree laughter, their faces lit up with mirth and mischievous jokes, while they pondered over food and the serving waiters. Their Annapurni mother watched, waving a wand or humming the crafty hum each moment. Thank you. Put it.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi Kananji, for your insights into Tamil social fabric and that wonderful excerpt that you read out, Annapurna Bhavan. It was lovely. Next I invite Dr. Meenakshi Balaji. Dr. Meenakshi Balaji is a writer, translator, reviewer, and critic. She teaches at Sri Venkateshwara College, University. She is President of the International Federation of Languages and Literatures, UNESCO, and Treasurer of the Indian Association of Australian Studies. Her interests include cultural, post-colonial, and English studies, children's literature, women's fiction, and film studies, areas which she has extensively researched on and written about. Among her publications are The Ultimate Colony, Desert in Blue, Filming the Line of Control, Rushdie the Novelist, 3 volumes of Indo-Australian stories entitled Fear Factor, Terror Incognito, Alien Shores, Tales of Refugees and Asylum Seekers, A House for Mr. Biswas, Critical Perspectives, and Only Connect, Technology and Us, and the children's book. The title I have fallen in love with, Little Elephant Throws a Party. Dr. Meenakshi Bharat.
Please let me know if I'm echoing, I'm fine, it's okay? All right.
Okay.
Before I begin, let me just thank the Sahitya Academy for inviting me and for Professor Manashri Dal for remembering that I write. And of course, thanks to the short story form for getting us all together here on this platform. I'm going to just speak for about 4 or 5 minutes about the short story and how I come to it. And I've written it because, as a teacher, one just gets carried away and starts off without knowing where the end is. So let me just, I've always been instinctually attracted to the short story form. Ever since I wrote my first in my early teens. Since then, I've tried to keep in touch both by the practice of writing the short story and by getting together anthologies dedicated to the form, as has been communicated to you. I write for children as well as for adults. In my years-long relationship with the form, one of the returning questions that has been posed to me, because of what I am and because of how I look, posed to me is how do I approach it as a woman writer? And this question has always troubled me. There have never been easy answers. The problem is that I've always believed that first and foremost, as a writer, I should have the freedom to choose what I want to write about, not be straitjacketed by the unwritten expectation that as a woman writer, I best only write about women's problems. If I didn't, then I could be seen as reneging on my duty to my kind. I've been reneging for a very long time. When I look back at the stories that I've written, I find that 80%, maybe more, 80% of my stories are not from the perspective of a woman. They are quite often male perspectives that I pick up. But every day, and this is the other side of it, that's why the problem. But every day, something happens in the world that demands that I especially speak up for my sisters. Every day I'm reminded that the question of the responsibility of the woman writer is as pointed and as problematic as ever. Having traversed feminisms of different kinds, as a teacher, as a practitioner, liberal, radical, Marxist, socialist, cultural, the contemporary women writers' responsibilities seem to have only multiplied. So, major quandary. It's never been easy to write as a woman writer at any point of time. But finally, I have to say that there is only one direction, at least for me, that I have to be true to the word, and that this word must come because I believe deeply in the issues that I take up. And whatever issue I take up, I should take with commitment. I have to shake off slavery to any polarizing ism, including feminism. I need to be individual, an entity that is gender sensitive, but not gender bound. I take inspiration from John Jakes' words
which ring true for all writers, male or female. He says, be yourself above all, let who you are, what you believe, shine through every sentence that you write. The issue may well be a women's issue, but equally it can be anything else. It may indeed be women-centric, driven by injustices done to her in this patriarchal setting. But it should not be the result of fashionable need to be a feminist, as is quite often the case. I do realize it's tremendously difficult to be this free. The market too expects, indeed demands, that as a woman writer I should be concerned only with women's issues and I should write only about women's issues. And the fact is that if one gets a collection of stories on women's issues, it's not easy to get published in any case, but if you have women-oriented stories, might get a publisher easier than a woman writing on other issues. Anyways, the short-sightedness of this severely narrow-minded publisher should not deter the woman from in the exercise of true freedom, true realization of the self. In embracing non-women preserves, she is in fact, and that's what I believe, fighting the battle on the final frontier and obliquely being a true feminist without ascribing to any particular strand. It is clear that no writer can escape the immediate surroundings, neither woman nor man. Like her male counterpart, the woman too has to take her cues from them and respond accordingly. Only her battle is harder. To me, the commitment to fight this battle and to persevere on the front, to realize my word, while being true both to it and to my subject, is my undeniable responsibility. Today seems to be such a time. Before I begin reading, I must say that I was torn between reading a story from a male perspective just to prove my point, and about the freedom of choice, my point of freedom of choice, and one about a woman. Recent brutalizing events, and we all read the papers, have taken me back to the most brutal event in our history, the partition, in which women were at the receiving end of much violence. I am a post-partition child, and yet I see the horror has not ended. It spills over. And my story is just, actually is about the spilling over of this horror. I'm going to read a part of my story, The Lost Kingdom. And I hope that what I've been talking about becomes clear in this. So The Lost Kingdom, but when she was left to her own resources, and the protagonist of the story is Raju. But when she was now in Punjab, from Tamil Nadu, moved to Punjab, and I hope you are going to take us to Bengal. But when she was left to her own resources, when Biji and Bauji were either taking their afternoon nap or were too busy to attend to her, she turned to her favorite pastime, climbing up the straight, narrow stairway to the rooftop, and looking over the parapet wall down into the derelict mosque next door. Standing on her toes, she would crane her little neck as forward and as high as she could. When she tired of that, she'd squat down on the rough brick floor and peek through the latticed brick parapet, straining to see what lay across. The sprawling courtyard of the mosque was overrun with tall, weedy overgrowths. In the south corner was a well, fringed at the back by straggly shrubs. In stark contrast to the general encompassing neglect, the 3-foot-high platform surrounding the well was spick and span, and in the mornings a fresh, bracing wetness clung to it. As the sun rose higher, it sucked the moisture, forming a tantalizing mosaic of wet and dry. Raju amused herself by picking out patterns in this wetness till the sun wore it dry. Then she would turn her gaze towards the open arches of the building. Of the four, 2 were covered by a makeshift curtain of a sari sewn to an old pulkari. The colors still had a vibrancy that reached out to the curious eyes of the little girl. Her 8-year-old mind waited. indeed willed someone to emerge from behind the shadows of the patchwork drapes. Rajo, oh Rajani, come and have food. Only Bauji's insistent call from downstairs would tear her away from her intent vigil. Now, the end of the vacation was here. The mystery was still unsolved. With just a day to go, she found that she couldn't get the mosque house out of her mind. Sitting right next to the kitchen fireplace, on her own special stringed stool, she ate her grandmother's aloo paratha to the accompaniment of tea and her favorite mango pickle. Today, she hardly registered the aroma or the taste. She didn't even ask for a baby follow-up paratha as she normally did. The thought of the mystery neighbors just wouldn't go away. Raju knew there was definitely a child, a boy, possibly about her age because she had seen kurta pajamas on the clothesline. Also, a woman. She had sometimes caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure wearing a salwar kameez darting across the courtyard. Now and then, Raju had seen this woman moving quickly, sometimes to hang out clothes to dry and at others to collect the dried clothes. The task accomplished, she dashed back to the refuge of the shadows of the arches. But Raju had never got to see her face. She always kept it covered by her chunni. Raju determined to ask her grandmother about it, but not in front of Bauji. Of that she was sure. He would not brook such unseemly inquisitiveness from his dearest grandchild. But she would have to do it soon because Daddy would be here any day now to fetch her from her month-long holiday in the tiny border village. E.g., she ventured that night, nestling into the crook of her grandmother's ankle arm. Can you tell me something? B.G. smiled down at Raju and asked her indulgently. Okay, which story do you want? The one about the beautiful princess who lost her kingdom? Or the one about the naughty boy who was punished? B.G. named her favorite stories. Who is the woman who lives next door? She blurted out hastily, unmindful of the options placed before her by her grandmother. B.G.'s arms tightened around Raju as she sharply intoned, "Go to sleep now, Buta. It's late." This wasn't the reply Raju was looking for. The harshness of the uncalled for and utterly uncharacteristic admonition brought smarting tears to her eyes. But hearing the sharp, disappointed intake of breath from the little girl, B.G. conceded. Her name is Bungi. At least that's what everybody calls her, since she cannot speak. When we came here at the time of the partition, she already had set herself up in the masjid. B.G. stopped speaking. After a brief silence, she continued. She's a refugee, like all of us. Everyone knows there's not a soul left in this village. Only owls hooting in the deserted streets. All the villagers seem to have left in a hurry, just as we had left our homes back in Lahore. B.G. retreated into thought, remembering more for herself than for her little listener. You know, this was a totally Muslim village. Raju did not know. And she couldn't understand what her grandmother was talking about either, as you can well make out from the name, Khanpur. As B.G. slowly and deliberately enunciated the name, a dark shadow flitted across her lined face. But B.G., Raju persisted, her question still unanswered. She keeps very much to herself, she doesn't come out, and no one comes to her house. There is little I can tell you apart from that. Now be a good girl and go to sleep. I'm tired. B.G. ended the conversation abruptly. She clearly had no energy or will left to humor her inquisitive little interlocutor. And Raju didn't press any further. The very next day, Raju ran across the brick lane that separated Bauji's house from the inscrutable ruins of the mosque. She couldn't reach the door knocker at the top of the tall, roughly hewn wooden door. She looked around for help. There was no one in the lane as far as her eye could see. But she spied a stick lying on the ground next to the hand pump in the corner of the lane. She ran and picked it up and started beating on the door. She carried on till she heard the sound of running footsteps. The door opened, and startled eyes behind the chimney peered questioningly at her. With the utter lack of self-consciousness of an 8-year-old, she ran straight into the courtyard and sat down on the ledge that skirted the well and said, "Where's your son? I've come to play with him." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she shook her head. "Call him out," Raju insisted. She couldn't understand what the problem was. Pungi's reluctance only made her impatient. Brushing the fast-flowing tears with the end of her chimney, the woman caught hold of her hand and pulled her into the cover of the mosque. On a neat but spare bed lay a child whose head lowered to one side, spit dribbling down the side of his mouth. Unfocused eyes looked vacantly at the ceiling, out of a face much older than what the pajama had led Raju to believe. Not knowing how to react, Raju turned back in bewilderment to the woman who had sat down on a rusty trunk and was weeping inconsolably and murmuring over and over again, "Hi, hi, why didn't death come to me then?" And she keened sorrowfully, rocking backwards and forwards rhythmically. This stopped Raju in her tracks. It was while before Raju registered that the dumb woman was actually speaking, uttering words. This frightened her. Unsure of what to do, she stood still for a long moment, and then she took to her heels. She scurried back to the enveloping folds of Gigi's motherly bosom, where she blurted out a garbled, excited account of what had just happened. She quietened after a while and got back to some play. That evening, Daddy came to pick her up and took her away. Gigi's sudden death and Bauji's subsequent move into their household kept Raju away from Kanpur for the next 8 years. Bauji's demise necessitated a village visit. While Daddy went about the task of winding up the house, Raju ran up to the roof for a glimpse of the mosque. It was there no longer. A small concrete house had taken its place, and children ran about the neat courtyard. Perplexed, she ran across to the neighbors. Omkar Chacha was in, and so were the rest of the family. She let loose a barrage of questions. At first she was met with stubborn silence, but ultimately they gave in, unable to withstand her dogged persistence. Bungi had been thrown out of the village with her idiot son, they told her. As soon as the villagers discovered that she could speak, they had beaten out the most shameful admissions from her. Her child was the offspring of the lustful, avenging riots of the partition bastard. But the most damaging revelation was the fact that she was not a refugee like them. She hadn't gone when she should have, to her side. She didn't belong on this side. There was no place for her with them. She had to go. 18 years after the divide, the naughty child had been punished and the beautiful princess had lost her kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matt, for that beautiful short story with mesmerizing narrative technique. It's lovely. And also for initiating you, sharing your firm position, firm intellectual position as a writer. Thanks a lot. Now I invite Dr. Nandini Singh. As Meenakshi ji pointed it out, first it was Tamil local, Tamil culture, then Punjabi. Now let's look forward to them. Nandini Singh ji teaches English in Delhi University. She is a noted scholar, creative writer, and critic. Her publications include The Black Woman Speaks, a study of Flora Navapa and Puchi Nari Chetna. I must not be the Nigerian writers. Through the Diasporic Lanes, volumes 1 and 2, Mahashweta Devi, Critical Perspectives. Her short stories have been featured in literary journals such as The Elusive Dawn and The Muse. She has been featured in the Asian Collective of Short Stories and the Australia-India collaboration, The Glass Walls. Her recent book, The Second Wife and Other Stories, is a collection of critically acclaimed feminist stories. I invite Nandini ji.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Primarily, let me thank Sahitya Academy and Professor Malashi Lal for inviting me here. And thank you to all these wonderful people who are here to listen to us. I was so immersed in the storytelling of my predecessors that I forgot that I was supposed to speak. I got completely the power of their storytelling took me. And like Meenakshi, being a teacher, one just goes on and on and on. So I thought I need to write things down lest I keep speaking and shoot the time limit completely. So very briefly, I will talk about, is it echoing? This is fine?
Just go back a bit.
Ah, bas.
Yeah, that's better.
This is fine. Okay, so very briefly I will talk about how I write, why I write. It kind of, I don't know, I think it keeps changing. But this set of recent occurrences that have happened, where the focus has suddenly again come back to the woman's body and how it becomes a site of torture, of dominance, of one-upmanship, and of establishing one's dominance via the woman's body. So I couldn't help but want to talk a little about it, because there are multiple reasons why one writes, but this particular reason, therefore, I thought, because it's now so potent that we cannot not talk about it. So in my creative writing, I pay attention to the discursive space of the female body. It is often implied that discourses about the fate of the woman under a patriarchal system already caters for the body of the woman. There is, however, the need to stage or foreground the female body by way of giving it a much closer attention, its discursive formation, its use and abuse, its process of inscription and its genderization, as it often fails to escape the exertions of patriarchy. I argue that the body aesthetics, I argue that in the process of inscribing gender and sexuality on the body and commodifying it, the question of body aesthetics is thrown up, the ironic privileging of the beautiful body, the place of the ugly body, the implications of the deformed body, and the entire artificial way of making the body what it is not. I try to address the gendered and commodified female body as a victim of patriarchal and institutional power that inscribes positions and prejudices on it and gestures it towards what one may call self-induced inferiority, even though there is always hope of self-emancipation. The mode I use is realistic, an everyday negotiation of life where victories are small, minuscule, and probably non-existent. The stories don't have neat, tied-up endings because life as we know it is not happily ever after. It's more in the genre of the absurd, like Sisyphus' curse, which is monotonous, boring, colorless, and repetitive. Much like the cooking that the woman does on a daily basis. And I've heard so many people say that it takes an hour to cook and 10 minutes to eat and then critique. But it's a never-ending process. So it's boring, it's colorless, it's repetitive. Life is not particularly very exciting all the time. The term I use for my stories is feminism with a small f, something I borrow from the famous Nigerian novelist Nari Chetna. It argues that the small f connotes rejection of absolutism and extremism in gender discourse and acceptance of the truth of paradox that permeates all cultures and human relationships. As one grows up amongst the lies perpetrated within the society, I keep saying this, that we've kind of grown up on lies. We're told, you do this, this will happen to you. You work like this will happen to you. And you realize it doesn't happen that way. And so many lies the women around you tell you, how you need to behave, how you need to sit, how you need to look. The endless lies that we grow up with. Gendered and schooled in terms of how to conduct oneself. There were two anchors which shaped one's life, education and sisterhood.
I mean, these are the two things that I see, and probably one of the reasons why we are here today. It's this sisterhood, this community of writers, this community of women celebrating women. And I feel that has sustained me in a huge way. And I guess it sustains many of us. So in the stories, I talk about education and I talk about sisterhood. Recent times have brought a consistent change in growing the strength of women's movements and its public visibility. The feeling of global sisterhood, referring to women's spirituality and community as a form of mutual support, focused on special problems and interests like motherhood, ecofeminism, self-development, healing, and education. Participation in internet virtual groups, consisting of both global and local networks, turns out to be an experience of being strong together, speaking our own voices, and finally standing up for women's rights. I mean, I'm going to talk about something rather innocuous, but there is a group there's a Facebook group that I am a part of called Gurgaon Moms. And I have never seen a more colorful group ever in my whole life. It celebrates, it has women who talk about their inability to wear a certain kind of dress, but they're able to post it on that group because everybody says, wow, you look so good. There are women who talk about, trying to survive an abusive marriage, and then there are people counseling them. So sometimes things like this become so empowering, something which one doesn't realize offhand. I was very skeptical when I joined the group and have started enjoying. I'm very silent, but I see the kind of things that are happening there. So speak in your own voices and finally standing up for women's rights. Having grown up on Tagore, these lines from his dance drama continue to inspire, and I'm sure most of you know what I'm talking about. His beautiful dance drama Chitrangada, where Chitrangada is talking to Arjun, where she finally, when she reveals herself in her own self, not the beautiful Chitrangada, but Chitrangada who she was. She tells Arjun, look at me closely. I'm Chitrangada, I'm the princess, I'm Chitrangada, I'm Rabindra. And then she tells him a few home truths. She says, don't treat me like a deity. I'm Chitrangada, I'll just quote rather than sort of. Don't treat me like a deity and don't treat me like an ordinary woman. Not a goddess of worship, not a commoner to be cast behind, but if you accept my rightful place in peril and in plenty, entrusting companionship through penance of suffering by your side, you may then realize who I am. And then she ends saying, I'm Chitrangada, Rajendra. And that's when Arjun finally bows down to her and continues. Now I had thought to read 2 or 3 stories, but seeing my predecessors reading just one, maybe I'll read just one and we can have a discussion later or whatever the audience wants. So this is a story about this girl who lives in this Mufassil area of Bengal. That's where she has grown up, and since everybody said Bengal, so I need to talk about Bengal. So that's where she's grown up, and her father doesn't know, father is a very average worker. Mother is most irritated with the father because he doesn't bring in too much money. The mother has rich relatives. They have never really met these relatives, but the mother never forgets to tell the father that my sister's one sari is equivalent to your entire year's kamai that you have. So you are nothing and nobody. And then one fine day, the sister decides to visit this poor sister. And it's like they're entertaining royalty. And that entertainment of royalty happens. And then a promise is made to this girl that we will take you to Calcutta and we will educate you. You will, the poorer set of families say help with her marriage, but this very generous, this Mr. Datta Chaudhary, who's very well versed, how he talks, how he dresses, very city bred. He says, no, why do you talk marriage? Let the girl come to Calcutta, we'll put her in college. And then the girl suddenly, the ocean, from the well, she literally, in her mind's eye, she's, a bigger world opens up for her, and she keeps waiting for that day when they will call her and then she'll go to Calcutta. So eventually she does come to Calcutta. Astam Navamita tried to adapt to her new life. The college in Kolkata was nothing like what she had imagined. Girls sashayed around in outlandish outfits. Men and women hung around in coffee houses where laughter mixed with cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. They knew so much, discussed so many things, that Nobo retreated to her own shell. She wanted to show off her new name. She would be Bonnie to friends. Instead, she landed up in her lonely corner of her class, shrinking into oblivion. In spite of her uncle and aunt's rather strange demeanor, she preferred the house to the outside. The day was fraught with innumerable chores, but Nobo did not mind doing these. She had spent her childhood years helping her mother anyway. The maids in the house who had earlier seemed hostile now warmed up to this girl. They talked to her about their poverty-stricken life, which had forced them to come to this merciless city. About Nobo, they wondered why any parent would let their only child lead such an existence in this strange rich man's abode. The maid saw in Nobo a companion, and she started to feel at ease with them. Her aunt remained busy participating in numerous social causes for which she had to travel across the city. Her uncle she barely saw. It seemed the man who had mesmerized her in Asansol had completely vanished. Only at night, when Nobunita retreated to her tiny room, would she dare to be her old self again. She would let her hair down and indulge in flights of fantasy in the letters that she sent home. College was fun, she would bluff, as is the house where ran the cynosure of Mishomoshai and Machimoni's eyes. She told them that the maids bowed to her out of respect, as did the driver who drove her to college. The girls in the college were envious of her new dresses and her stunning hairdos. Maya, the mother, shed tears of happiness as she read the letters aloud to her husband. Jochon, the father, tried to sound happy too, but a strange worry for his only child kept gnawing at his soul. Of course, Nobo had categorically discouraged them from visiting the Kolkata house. Days rolled into months. From being the beloved daughter of her parents, Nobo now became a pale shadow of the person she once had been. Not being academically inclined, college failed to hold any charm for her. Her only release came from the letters she wrote, creating imaginary oases in her desert-like existence. One day she learned from the maids that her aunt would be traveling to Burdwan for a meeting. She would be gone for 2 nights, and the preparations were on for the impending trip. Her aunt gave instructions to the cook and the kitchen help. There were no special instructions for Nobo, other than the usual stuff. She needed to behave properly, dress modestly, not stay out late or go flirting with men, and so on. Seema, the elderly cook, was tasked to keep an eye on her. Though Nobo had very little interaction with her aunt, she still heaved a sigh of relief. To celebrate her freedom, she decided not to go to college and to stay with the maids in the kitchen instead. The maids were quite happy to have an extra helping hand. In the evening, she retreated early into her room and lay on the bed reading. Not being much of a reader, the book soon slipped from her hand and she dozed off. Suddenly, Nobo woke up to a strange sensation of a hand groping her waist. As she tried to scream, the hand cupped her mouth. She tried to scream again, but her voice was muffled. And then an urgent but rather caring voice spoke to her. "It's me, child. Relax. Don't be afraid." Nobo was certain she was in the midst of a nightmare when she distinctly heard Roti Babu's voice repeat what she had heard before. "Bonnie, it's me. Now be a good girl. Just relax." A stunned Nobo lay still like a paralyzed rag doll, unable to understand what was happening. Roti Babu's experienced hand ran all over her body, coaxing her to respond. He cupped her breast, kissed her on the mouth repeatedly. He undid the drawstrings of her salwar, rubbing her heart till she was sore. At her utter lack of response, the hands which had been gentle so far were now rough, as was his mouth offending. He bit her and mauled her while his body ravaged hers. He flung her all over the bed and floor like a hapless prey, and then suddenly it was over, as if nothing had happened. Even if Nobo wanted to believe that this was a bad dream, the drops of blood on the bed, the bite marks on her breast, and the searing pain between her legs confirmed that her life had changed forever. Seema, the elderly maid who had been instructed to keep an eye on her, carried her food to the room. She was gentle as she helped Nobo from the bed to the mora, on which she sat gingerly to eat her food. Not a word was exchanged between the two, but Nobo knew she had a sympathizer in the house. Seema picked up the soiled sheets and left the room. The following night, Nobo pleaded with her. "Please stay with me, Mashi. I can't, dear," was all Seema would say. Nobo stayed awake. A million things were passing through her head. Her uncle, The respected Mr. Brokiraj Dr. Chaudhary had raped her. What if she was already pregnant or infected with some deadly disease? How would she deal with all this? Who would believe her story? How would she escape from this house? And if at all she did, would she be able to face her parents? When Roti Babu walked in, this time there was no preamble, no attempt at conversation. Nabu was surprised at her own reaction. Instead of rebelling, her body just gave in. This pleased Roti Babu enormously. The biting and mauding lessened. He said she was very beautiful. He said he would take care never to impregnate her. It was only by being his special woman that she would learn how to please her future husband. I'm skipping a bit here. Roti Babu remembered the time when he had first met Nabu. He knew he had to have her, but had decided to give her time to grow up. A young girl would give her all to her benefactor, and Roti Babu had entered her life before anyone else had. He was convinced he was her first love, and slowly he would mold her entirely to his life. He wished he could do more for her, take her to the cinema and the like, but given his station in life, that was not possible. His chest puffed up with self-importance. He hailed from a distinguished family, but he had not rested on his laurels. The love and respect he earned from the ruling party was because of his sustained efforts at keeping the party coffers ringing. All this could not be compromised for the state of a girl. Slowly and steadily he walked towards the room. She was in there, standing still. Roti Babu noticed that she had not changed out of her sari. He had brought her so many lacy nightgowns, but this girl still carried on with her small town habits. A nasty comment rose to his lips, which he stifled. No point spoiling the evening. He walked up to her and held her in his arms. How tiny she is. I need to feed her up a bit, he thought. He continued to kiss her on the mouth as he led her to the bed. Slowly, Nabu extricated herself and helped him lie down. Good, she's learning, he thought, as he closed his eyes in sweet anticipation. His dhoti had come undone, and as he lay back, letting the young girl take the lead. Occasionally he liked that. She was a good learner. Suddenly he felt something hard, sharp and steely pressing against his neck. At first he ignored it, but then it began to cut into his skin. Bonnie, he tried to call out, but there she was standing next to him, pressing the sharp edge of the moti something cut with against his throat. He shut his eyes, willing the nightmare to pass, but the pain was unbearable. I will not tell you the end. I'll leave you for to read the story. So, but like I said, it doesn't have a very neatly tied end. So she picks up the moti from the kitchen and she faces her uncle with it. I will just read the last two lines. Unafraid, Navonita pulled her sari tightly around her frail body and continued walking briskly on the cobbled streets of this very, very unfamiliar city. Suddenly, it didn't seem unfamiliar to her anymore. Can I read another one or? So I think this is it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nandini. Now that all the three writers have spoken about their creative writing as well as sharing their worldviews and read out excerpts or short stories from their recent writings, I now request the audience, if any one of you intends to ask a question or interact with any of the guest writers, that we have 5-7 minutes left for interaction we can have.
I do have a question, and this is to the. I'm a friend of Meenakshi Bharat, so I won't ask her. But it is a reference to what she said. I'm asking the other two speakers. I mean, she mentioned about the compulsion for a woman writer to write about women. Is that something you face, and are you able to break out of that as she has done?
because this is what appealed a lot to me in her presentation, that you don't need to stereotype a woman writer as somebody who's going to write feminist issues only. She has other things to do. But then you get into, there are these riddles that happen. See, like, I can feel guilty of writing stories which have men as center stage. And sometimes they show women in a very poor light. You don't know how I have been told about it. Because writing such stories, and one of the stories got me an award. And so people say, why is anybody giving an award to Lakshmi when she's showing women in this man's Sahitya square? In such a poor life, they're such bitchy women, and he's so noble. So why should she get an award at all? It's something which is so curious. So this award will be special because it bristles with their listening. So this is a very good question, and like very early on, you said you can be gender sensitive. Why should you be gender bound? So this is where we don't get selected at women only anthologies. Yeah.
Well, I think to answer your question, the very first story in this volume, which had actually won the Times Award, was a story from a male point of view. It's about a male writer and how he portrays his own brother and what happens. So yeah, we're not really bound by having to tell women's stories from a woman's point of view. Since we call ourselves creative writers, we allow our creativity to take over. It's, how do I say it? I don't know about you two, but I see this about me. So I feel more often than not it is the story which is carrying me, rather than me carrying the story. I might in my head have thought differently, but when I start to write down, very often I feel it's the characters which are driving me or a story which is telling itself. So it can be from whoever's point of view, but the story gets told. So no, and we do get picked up, even if we are not writing, stories centering entirely around women.
Have you faced, I would use a stronger word, a ridicule or something, when you've written a woman in a poorer image? Have you faced that ever? Like, Professor said that?
No, not really. In fact, the people have been generous. But one criticism I have faced, and it has come from one of my erstwhile professors, very sweetly, he picked up the book on his own and he read and sent me a very beautiful message. And later he said, there aren't too many good men in your book actually. And I promise to revise that when the next book comes.
Thank you.
Namaskar. Just related questions. The male character attracts you while writing or female most?
This is quite an interesting question.
I think what Nandini said just a little while ago, that it's a story that takes you along with it. And as I said right at the beginning, that almost 80 plus percentage of my stories have non-women characters. But I need to clarify something. Here. It's not a question of who attracts me more or what attracts me more. It's a story which will take me to a particular character, presentation or perspective, character perspective. But even though I say that 80-85% of my stories they're not women-centric. Nonetheless, I find that, and that's directly related to what I said, that it's the issue which is important to me. And every issue, if it touches a man, it definitely touches a woman. It definitely touches a woman. And therefore, the stories that I write will reach out to womankind, definitely. And within the stories themselves, I mean, if anyone cares to go to the stories, within the stories themselves, I started analyzing them after I sat here. But within the stories itself, the men are taken, their perspectives are taken to the composite humanity and to womankind inclusive.
Just to answer the same question, I think I would completely agree with what you said.
I now request Professor Malashwiji to conclude this wonderful session. After which, the little elephant will certainly throw a party.
Good afternoon, everyone. After such excellent storytelling, such thoughtful presentations and gripping narratives, there's not much left for me to say. But I will just take a few minutes to reflect on the idea of Nari Chetna and remind ourselves that many writers have acknowledged that the creative mind is androgynous. So when I hear each one of our speakers talk about the perspective from which they write or the subjects that they prefer to pick up, I was constantly reminded of that particular word, which is androgyny. In a strange way, I think it's Rabindra who comes back to me, because you can have a lot of Nari Chetna that is presented by men writers. And we've had several others, certainly in the corpus of Indian literature. There have been people like Premchand, Bhisham Sani, and several others. But in the world of Indian writing in English, the novel form has been given priority over the short story form until lately. So the discovery of the potential of that moment when something happens, a vignette which can be expanded into a story. Our three speakers today have given us excellent examples of how that moment expands. But to link that to what I said about androgyny, two stories of Tagore which I'm sure everybody here remembers. One is Stree Potro, the wife's letter, and the other is Kabuliwala. Two very different stories, but each one of them tightly structured. But when you look at what they're covering, Kabuliwala has a story from when that little Minnie was a small child, and it ends at a point when she's getting married. All of that is brought in. And the issue of an Afghani trader, the otherness, the suspicion of the stranger, all that. And the perspective is that of the father, or it is that of the male trader. But nevertheless, the story is centered on that little girl child, who as a girl child becomes a very important point in our current considerations. The exact opposite seems to happen with Mrinal in the story Wife's Letter, because it is just one single letter that Mrinal is writing to her husband after she's left that household and come away, and she discovers her agency and her selfhood. In those few pages, she encapsulates what her experience has been in being in a conservative Bengali household, how the self-awareness comes to her, and how the courage to leave it also comes to her. The whole story of feminist evolution, emancipation, liberation, choice, all of that is embedded in the story. I just thought I'd mention those as examples of what the short story form can do. Now the English Advisory Board, which I have the absolute privilege and honor to be heading at present in the Sahitya Academy, is holding as its objective the idea of presenting the link between English writing and other languages of India. And I'm so happy that Lakshmi talked about Tamil Nadu. We didn't plan any of this, it just happened. That Lakshmi took us to Tamil Nadu and that Meenakshi talked about post-partition and Punjab and memories of that time, and that Nandini took us to Bengal, and I think in a way have driven us towards the Hindi writing as well. So thank you very much for a wonderful session with each of the three writers and this wonderful audience for being here. Thanks.
Well, this segment of Nari Chetna ends here. We will have some tea together. Thank you all.
Thank you, Krishna.